They assumed I'd remain silent because I resided beyond their manicured borders. They believed that consistently shoveling their winter accumulation onto my property was simply part of their routine. No prior authorization, no apology offered, just 50 tons of frozen filth inundating my land, causing my self-constructed shed to buckle and collapse. What they failed to grasp was that I possess an unyielding memory for intrusions. I do not disregard established boundaries, nor do I permit those who bully to shield themselves behind bureaucratic regulations. Consequently, I collected every particle of their discarded snow and erected a bulwark they could not possibly overlook. A wall, 7 feet in height, fully compliant with regulations, solid and immutable. And when their entreaties for leniency echoed from beyond its impassive face, I merely observed its gradual dissolution, recognizing that justice, much like melting snow, ultimately finds its natural equilibrium. This place has been my sanctuary for 11 years. It's not a sprawling estate, but it is unequivocally mine. 2 acres of undulating brushland and gravel, situated just beyond the meticulously kept gates of the Sterling Pines Estate subdivision. Close enough to feel the occasional tremor of their imposed rules and ordinances, yet sufficiently remote that I once harbored the naive belief I had entirely evaded their jurisdiction. My land is genuinely my own, unburdened by restrictive covenants, free from the obligation of monthly dues siphoned into external accounts, and unmarred by petty notifications regarding paint colors or grass length. I deliberately selected this locale. After 2 decades of military service, subjected to perpetual directives and an unyielding structure dictated by others' schedules, I yearned for a secluded corner of the world where no one could dictate my life on my legally acquired property. I personally erected the tool shed, fused the weathered mailbox to a robust steel post sunk deep in concrete, and carved out a lengthy dirt driveway that announces every arrival with a satisfying crunch under tires, particularly during the winter months. I never enrolled in the HOA. That was a conscious decision. Upon finalizing the paperwork, I meticulously verified every survey line and boundary marker. My goal was unadulterated freedom. However, on the morning following the season's inaugural substantial blizzard, as I stepped onto my porch with a steaming mug of coffee, I nearly dropped it in shock. My entire rear fence line, effectively half my property, was submerged beneath a colossal mound of frozen debris, reaching a staggering 8 feet high in some sections. This was not the delicate, sparkling powder that had descended softly through the night. No, this was dense, compacted, grayish slush, liberally mixed with road salt, embedded with grit and tire lubricant, unmistakably the refuse from cleared roadways. It had been deposited here with deliberate intent. Initially, I considered the possibility that wind or gravity might have shifted the snowdrift from the incline above, but the evidence clearly indicated otherwise. Heavy, grooved tracks, consistent with those left by a skid steer or dump truck, traversed my land directly, entering from the eastern boundary without any sign of hesitation or authorization. I slowly followed them, my boots sinking into the hardened surface until the trail vanished beneath the immense pile. The tracks extended beyond the eastern boundary post, brightly marked in yellow for visibility, as if the marker itself were invisible to the driver. There was no note, no apology, no warning sign, merely a mountain of someone else's winter detritus now claiming residence on my soil. I stood there, the biting wind whipping crystalline ice against my collar, attempting to process this flagrant violation. It wasn't until I heard the distant, intermittent beeping of a plow's reversing alarm from across the road that the full realization settled in my gut like a heavy stone. The HOA, Sterling Pines Estates, was situated directly opposite my property. Identical homes arranged in neat rows, uniform mailboxes, winding lanes, all maintained with a rigidity that the governing board seemed to believe rivaled military precision. I had weathered minor skirmishes previously, passive-aggressive flyers concerning noise when I operated my chainsaw at dawn, veiled reminders about property lines. Nothing that ever escalated into open confrontation, but this was far beyond a minor transgression. This constituted trespassing, property damage, and the unauthorized dumping of waste onto private property. I trudged back up the driveway, my boots crunching on the hardened surface, and proceeded directly to the shed. I retrieved a folding ruler, a level, and a metal survey stake I kept for re-establishing old fence lines. Minutes later, I was back at the northeast corner marker, taking precise measurements until I reached the edge of the glacial heap. 10 feet within my property line, unequivocally. They had not merely permitted an overflow, they had actively driven their plows across the county road, past my clearly posted boundary, and offloaded their community's burden directly onto my acreage. I returned indoors, removed my boots, and opened my laptop. The email I composed was calm, factual, and professional, addressed to Karen Delaney at sterlingpineshoa.org. Subject: unauthorized displacement of frozen refuse onto private property. I attached photographs taken moments earlier, along with GPS screenshots pinpointing the exact coordinates, and concluded with a straightforward request: immediate removal, coupled with an assurance that this incident would not recur. I anticipated no immediate warmth nor swift action. However, 2 hours later, Karen Delaney's reply appeared in my inbox: Mr. Bishop, thank you for your concern. Due to limited public disposal options and ongoing emergency clearance operations, some redistribution of winter accumulation may extend beyond HOA boundaries. We appreciate your understanding during this severe weather event. Best regards, Karen Delaney, President Sterling Pines, HOA. Redistribution. That was her chosen term, as if relocating tons of contaminated ice onto private land were a minor, inevitable consequence of winter itself rather than a calculated act of trespass. I read her message 3 times. Then I gazed out the window at the imposing mound, salt crystals glinting faintly in the weak sunlight. The coffee in my mug had grown cold, but the anger accumulating in my chest burned with a steady, slow intensity. This wasn't about frozen slush. It was about ownership, boundaries, and respect. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty: if I allowed this to pass without consequence, they would bury me under their problems again and again, both literally and figuratively. I created a new folder on my desktop, simply titled Sterling Pines Winter Violations. The initial photographs went in, followed by the GPS logs and Karen's email. I wasn't yet certain where this would lead, but one thing was indisputable: I would not be silenced and buried. The morning after Karen's dismissive response, I drove into town under a sky still heavy with the threat of more winter weather. I needed supplies, not for immediate retribution, but for clarity. I purchased a dozen bright red fiberglass stakes, the kind topped with reflective bands that catch headlights like warning beacons in the dark. I also acquired a thick spool of yellow caution tape, the heavy-duty industrial roll typically used on construction sites, impossible to overlook, impossible to dismiss as an accident. Back home, I began at the tree line and meticulously worked my way along the entire eastern boundary, marking every painstaking foot from the woods down to the county road. I hammered those stakes into the frozen ground with a mallet, the sharp impacts echoing with finality in the cold air. Between each post, I stretched the yellow tape taut, securing it tightly so it snapped and fluttered in the wind like a procession of defiant flags. From a distance, it resembled the perimeter of a crime scene, and in many respects it was. Their actions had transgressed far beyond mere neighborly oversight into outright violation. I stepped back to survey the newly defined line. The invisible had been made vividly, undeniably apparent. It declared without words, "This is mine. Stay out." Around noon, a familiar blue Ford F-150 bearing the Sterling Pines HOA emblem cruised slowly past my driveway. At the wheel sat Cole Mason, one of the board members, easily recognizable by his perpetual scowl and the clipboard he always carried, as if constantly measuring lawns or tallying violations. He rolled his window down just enough to cast a long, disapproving stare in my direction as he passed. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just that silent judgment before he accelerated away. That evening, another email from Karen awaited me in my inbox. "Mr. Bishop, we have reviewed your concerns and noted the placement of your boundary markers. However, as your property lies outside the jurisdiction of the Sterling Pines HOA, it is not subject to our standard winter clearance protocols. Please understand that we are responsible for the safety and accessibility of an entire community, and we cannot guarantee that adjacent wintry accumulation or emergency operations will not occasionally impact neighboring lots. Best regards, Karen Delaney. It was a polite shrug, wrapped in bureaucratic language. She framed the situation as if I were the unreasonable party, as if accepting tons of contaminated ice on my land were simply the cost of residing adjacent to their perfect little enclave. I was still rereading her words, feeling the quiet burn of indignation rise when a low mechanical rumble vibrated through the floorboards. I glanced out the window and observed it, a yellow Caterpillar skid steer lumbering down the HOA's side lane, dragging a trail of scraped ice behind it. Then, without a moment's hesitation, it crossed the road, dipped into my ditch, and dumped another full bucket of gray, salt-laced slush directly onto my property, mere feet beyond the fluttering yellow tape and the freshly planted red stakes. They weren't ignoring me, they were challenging me. I pulled on my coat and gloves and marched down the slope. By the time I reached the boundary, the machine was already reversing, its engine growling as it retreated towards Sterling Pines. The operator never slowed, never looked my way, simply executed the dump and vanished as if my presence, my markers, my land itself were irrelevant. I stood there in the fading light, my breath fogging in the frigid air, and allowed the moment to sink in. This was no accident. This was deliberate defiance. I took more photographs. Close-ups of the fresh tire grooves slicing across my property line. Wide shots showed the new mound engulfing one of the red stakes like a slowly moving avalanche. I recorded a short video, my voice steady on the audio track, narrating timestamps, coordinates, and the blatant disregard on display. Evidence didn't require shouting, it only required precision. That night, I sent a second email. No pleasantries this time. Attached was a PDF compiling the latest timestamped images, GPS data, and highlighted excerpts from the county code governing property rights and waste disposal. I concluded with a single unambiguous sentence. Any further unauthorized displacement will be fully documented and reported to municipal authorities. Her response arrived the next morning, quicker than I expected, almost as if she had been anticipating it. Mr. Bishop, we have reviewed the materials you provided. While we do not share your interpretation of events, the board has voted to suspend any further displacement activity adjacent to your property for the remainder of the winter season. Please note, however, that Sterling Pines' HOA accepts no liability for indirect accumulation resulting from municipal operations or natural weather patterns. Sincerely, Karen Delaney. A small concession wrapped in layers of denial. They were retreating just enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. I recognized the tactic: yield a little ground, sound reasonable, wait for the storm, literal or figurative, to pass, then test the boundary again. I was not fooled. That same day, I climbed a sturdy oak at the upper edge of the slope and mounted a trail camera, a high-resolution, motion-activated unit with infrared night vision. I aimed it squarely at the usual dumping zone. I created a detailed spreadsheet with columns for date time, vehicle description, and estimated volume under weather conditions. Every interaction, every storm, every glimpse of HOA equipment would be logged. I even reached out discreetly to an old contact from my consulting days with the city, someone in zoning enforcement who still owed me a favor. I didn't ask for action, only clarification on procedure. I wanted to understand precisely how strong a case I could build if the ceasefire proved temporary. Part of me hoped it wouldn't come to that. Part of me hoped the markers, the emails, the cold weight of documentation had finally driven the point home. That hope lasted exactly 4 days. Then the next major storm rolled in, and with it, the illusion shattered once more. The next storm arrived on a Thursday night, fierce and unrelenting. Heavy wet flakes slammed against the windows like thrown gravel, piling up rapidly under a wind that howled through the pines. I stayed awake late, watching the security light carve pale tunnels through the swirling white, listening to branches bend under the growing weight. By dawn, the world outside was transformed, blanketed, muffled, locked in ice, and my land was once again buried, deeper this time, wider. The red stakes I had hammered in with such deliberate care were completely obscured, swallowed beneath 5 additional feet of compacted, salt-streaked refuse. The yellow caution tape hung in ragged shreds, some sections frozen stiff into the crystalline mass, others flapping limply like surrender flags after a lost battle. The tire tracks were fresh, unmistakable, wide grooves cutting straight through where my boundary markers had stood proudly only days before. This was not oversight. This was not even defiance anymore. This was erasure. A slow, cold rage settled in my chest. Not the explosive kind that shouts and slams doors, but the quiet, immovable sort that hardens over time like ice thickening on a lake. I stood at the edge of the violation that Friday morning, my breath fogging in the frigid air, and stared at the latest glacial heap dominating my slope. They had plowed right over my warnings, literally and figuratively. I decided then that words alone would no longer suffice. I needed a response they couldn't ignore, one built from irrefutable proof. I retreated to the shed and retrieved my old GoPro, its battery still holding a charge from occasional trail use. I mounted it high on a sturdy metal pole at the upper tree line, angled precisely toward the habitual dumping zone. I connected it to a weatherproof power bank and set it to motion-triggered recording, day or night. The next day, I added a second layer of surveillance, another infrared trail camera positioned lower for overlapping coverage. No blind spots, no excuses. Then I turned to the digital battlefield. I created dated subfolders, meticulously organized. Every video clip was renamed with a timestamp and description. Every photograph received embedded GPS metadata. Using satellite imagery, I overlaid transparent property lines, mine in bold red, theirs in blue, and traced arrows showing the exact paths of their equipment, entry points, turning radii, and dump locations. I built a visual chronicle that left nothing to interpretation. It took hours to reconstruct just the most recent incursions, but by the end, I possessed something undeniable. A step-by-step timeline proving that Sterling Pines HOA was engaged in repeated, systematic trespass and illegal displacement of contaminated winter waste onto private land. By Sunday, I had cataloged 6 distinct violations in under 2 weeks. Using rough density estimates, approximately 20 pounds per cubic foot, I calculated they had offloaded more than 50 tons of road-gridded, chemically laced ice onto my acreage. 50 tons that would leach salt into my soil, crush vegetation come spring, and potentially damage the shallow drainage running toward the trees I had planted years ago. I cross-referenced local ordinances until the relevant sections were committed to memory. County Code Section 4.12 on winter operations and waste disposal was crystal clear. No private entity, contractor, or association shall relocate accumulated ice onto adjacent private property without explicit written consent from the landowner. I had never given consent, not once, and now I had high-definition footage to prove it. Still, I held off on formal reporting. There was one question gnawing at me, one piece I needed to understand before escalating further. Why? Why go to the effort of crossing the road, navigating my ditch, climbing the gentle rise, just to unload here? Sterling Pines had designated retention areas deeper inside their own boundaries. They could have contracted proper municipal sites, so why risk the liability on a quiet, non-HOA neighbor? The answer came unexpectedly over coffee and small talk at the local hardware store. I was restocking memory cards and heavy-duty zip ties when I bumped into Ben Holtz, a snow removal contractor I'd known casually for years through American Legion events. After the usual pleasantries, I steered the conversation toward the subdivision across from my place. Sterling Pines? Ben's face tightened. Yeah, I bid on their contract last fall. Didn't get it. Went to some cut-rate outfit out of county. Word is, Karen Delaney pushed through a cost-saving initiative this season. They're handling everything in-house. In-house meaning? I prompted. He glanced around, lowered his voice. meaning they're supposed to stockpile internally, but everyone knows those retention basins fill fast. Rumor is they quietly arranged access to neighboring undeveloped parcels for overflow. No permits, no contracts, just convenient empty space. Undeveloped parcels, empty space. That was their phrase for my 2 acres. To them, land without an HOA badge was fair game, unoccupied, uncomplaining, invisible. They had weighed the odds. A solitary veteran living outside their gates, minding his own business. He'll grumble, maybe send an email, but he won't fight. They miscalculated because I wasn't just solitary, I was methodical. I had time, patience, and a spine forged in harder winters than this. That night, I compiled everything into a comprehensive 8-page dossier. Full-color photographs, video frame captures, satellite overlays, direct ordnance quotes, and a concise narrative of events. I printed it on heavy stock, slid it into a clear weatherproof sleeve, and walked it across the road to the HOA clubhouse Dropbox, addressed personally to Karen Delaney. No cover letter, no threats, just the unvarnished truth laid out like evidence on a courtroom table. 3 days passed in silence. Then, on a crisp Wednesday morning, a marked sheriff's SUV eased into my gravel driveway. 2 deputies emerged. Deputy Jenkins, a solid, no-nonsense veteran I recognized from previous minor calls in the area, and a younger trainee at his side. They were courteous, but official. "Morning, Mr. Bishop," Jenkins began. "We received a report concerning potential obstruction of emergency routes and interference with snow removal operations. Mind if we take a look around?" I invited them in without hesitation. Over coffee at my kitchen table, I walked them through the entire timeline. Dates, images, videos, code violations. They watched the footage in silence, brows furrowing deeper with each clip of HOA equipment crossing my line. When I finished, Jenkins closed his notebook slowly. "Between you and me," he said, "this doesn't look like a criminal matter on your end. If anything, you've built a textbook civil case. Repeated trespass after written warnings. Strong one." "I've warned them multiple times," I confirmed. "Email, certified letter, hand-delivered report." They left with digital copies of everything and a promise to log it properly. I watched their SUV pull away, only to stop briefly at the clubhouse where Karen waited in her signature red blazer, gesturing animatedly. Jenkins listened, nodded once, then drove off without further engagement. I didn't know what she'd hoped to achieve by calling them on me. Intimidation, perhaps, a show of authority. But all she accomplished was adding another official record to my growing file. Because this wasn't over. They weren't just displacing winter waste, they were displacing responsibility. And sooner or later, I intended to return it all, every bit of it, right back to their doorstep. The pristine white envelope arrived without fanfare, slid quietly into my mailbox by some unseen hand. Embossed lettering gleamed across the top. Sterling Pines. Homeowners Association. Official board correspondence. There was no stamp, no postmark, just that faint aroma of entitlement that seemed to permeate their every creation. I left it on the kitchen counter for a while, brewing a fresh pot of coffee and observing the delicate frost patterns as they formed on the window pane. I had long ago understood the wisdom of not rushing into conflict. Often, the most strategic move is to allow your opponent to reveal their intentions first. When I finally opened the correspondence, the contents were precisely as I had anticipated, polished, veiled, and pointed. The subject read, "Cease and desist." The charge was interference with community operations. The letter detailed how Mr. Bishop's recent actions, including the placement of physical markers, ongoing video monitoring of association property and personnel, and persistent documentation efforts, had generated undue friction and potentially jeopardized the safety of residents and contractors. It formally directed me to immediately halt all unauthorized recording, monitoring, and any activities that could be construed as obstructing essential seasonal maintenance or emergency access routes. It concluded with a warning that failure to comply could result in legal action. This was signed, "Sincerely, the Board of Directors, Sterling Pines HOA." A classic example of HOA bureaucracy, vague enough to sound menacing, yet specific enough to exert pressure, Unauthorized surveillance on my own trees, facing my own land, interfering with operations that were already unlawful. They were twisting the narrative, portraying me as the aggressor for simply defending my own property. This did not deter me. It clarified my position. I filed the letter with my growing collection of evidence and returned to my laptop. That evening, I immersed myself in their world. I downloaded the complete bylaws of Sterling Pines HOA, encompassing hundreds of pages of covenants, restrictions, and appendices. Tucked away in Section 7, I discovered a clause mandating the annual submission of snow removal contracts to the city, complete with verified disposal sites that did not encroach on municipal roads or private property. Non-compliance carried the risk of penalties, permit revocation, and board liability. I broadened my search to the County Code archives, where I found Chapter 12.14, titled Unlawful Use of Private Land for Waste Disposal. Repeated trespassing for the purpose of discarding refuse, including seasonal ice, was explicitly listed as grounds for civil action and mandatory municipal inspection. I picked up the phone and contacted Dinah, a former colleague from a zoning reform project years prior. She had transitioned into code enforcement consulting and still maintained valuable contacts downtown. Without divulging every detail, I outlined the pattern: recurring intrusions, ignored warnings, and documented equipment crossings. "What you're describing," she stated cautiously, "sounds like a textbook land use violation. With timestamps, mapping, and footage, you could file tomorrow and have a strong chance of enforcement." "I'm not there yet," I replied, "but I'm building the foundation." "Smart," she said. "Layer it thick. They'll lawyer up fast." I thanked her and ended the call, already envisioning the structure of a formal complaint. Later that same night, another plow rumbled through the darkness, but this time it hesitated at the edge of the county road, its engine idling as if in doubt. The blade pushed a wide berm along the curb, hovering uncertainly before finally reversing and retreating back into the subdivision. No new mound appeared on my slope. They were wavering. It was progress, but I knew better than to celebrate. Those who wield petty power rarely relinquish it willingly. The following morning, I dispatched a certified letter, the old-fashioned, trackable, undeniable way, to the HOA clubhouse. Enclosed were a bullet-point summary of 6 documented violations, a high-resolution map highlighting boundary lines and incursion paths, printed excerpts from relevant statutes, and a concise final notice. Effective immediately, any further unauthorized displacement onto my property will trigger direct reporting to the City of Rosegate Land Use Enforcement Division. I will also pursue full recovery of damages stemming from property degradation, structural impacts, and unlawful environmental contamination. Consider this official notification. I retained the signing receipt, the tracking number, every shred of proof. Over the weekend, a crew arrived. Not city trucks, but a private landscaping company sporting Sterling Pines vests. They spent hours using shovels and snowblowers to chip away at the edges of the massive heaps on my land. They didn't clear everything, far from it, but they removed enough to expose patches of frozen grass and reveal a few of my buried red stakes. It wasn't remediation, it was damage control, a silent acknowledgement. I watched from the porch, thermos in hand, offering no words, no gestures. Karen didn't appear. Cole didn't drive by. But the message had been received. Still, a sense of unease lingered. This was no longer solely about my acreage. It was about a mindset, a casual presumption that anyone outside their gated enclave was disposable, that rules were merely suggestions for others. And then came the storm that none of them had foreseen, the one that didn't bury my land, but theirs. The nor'easter struck with relentless force, a rare inland phenomenon, packing heavy, wet snow followed by a flash freeze that transformed every surface into a sheet of solid ice. 30 inches fell in a single night. Branches snapped like gunshots, and power lines sagged under the immense weight. I had faced worse in my life. Deployments where winter was not an inconvenience but a lethal adversary. I respected storms the way one respects a predator. You don't provoke it, but you prepare. That morning, I layered up and stepped out into a hushed, snow-entombed world. My breath hung thick in the air as I crunched along the back path toward the tree line. When I rounded the corner and saw the shed, or rather the space where it had stood, a tightness gripped my chest. The roof had collapsed under the accumulated wait weeks of their illegal debris, topped by nature's final, crushing blow. The metal frame was buckled inward like crumpled foil. The walls had caved in, hinges ripped from their mounts, plywood splintered and half buried. Tools lay scattered. My late wife's gardening tools, cherished items she had loved, pots she had painted, were buried beneath the wreckage. It wasn't just storage lost, it was history, memory, a structure that had withstood every season since I had built it. Crushed not only by the storm, but by the pattern, the relentless, sanctioned disregard that had piled burden upon burden until something finally broke. The quiet anger I had harbored for weeks solidified into resolve. This was no longer mere property damage. It was the breaking point. I turned back to the house, my boots carving deep tracks, and sat at my desk. No more polite emails, no more certified warnings. I opened a new document and began drafting a formal incident report to the city, complete with every date, every frame, every calculated ton, and now the collapsed shed with repair estimates attached. I included a direct request for an immediate municipal inspection of Sterling Pines' winter disposal practices. I didn't send it. Not yet. First, I had one final task. I needed them to feel the burden they had imposed on me. I needed to return it, load by careful load. I fired up my compact track loader, the one I had bought used for driveway work, and listened to its engine growl to life. Then I began scooping their refuse, their salt-laced, contaminated debris, and moving it with deliberate precision, not across their line, but right up to it, where it would have the most impact. I started with the frozen debris closest to my eastern boundary, the same contaminated heaps they had repeatedly dumped over the past month. Bucket by bucket, I scooped the dense, salt-encrusted refuse, the gritty slush carrying the scent of diesel and dicer. My loader's engine growled low and steady as I maneuvered carefully, never once crossing onto their pavement. I remained firmly on my side of the line, every movement deliberate, every load calculated. Their only true exit, Pinecone Circle, curved gently downhill from the heart of Sterling Pines, funneling all 30-odd households toward the main county road. At the point where their asphalt met my gravel shoulder, the space narrowed just enough to be vulnerable, just wide enough for what I had in mind. A barricade. I dumped the first loads along that shoulder, then used the blade to pack them tight, compressing the mass into a solid core. Subsequent passes layered more height and depth. By late afternoon, I had sculpted a formidable wall, nearly 7 feet tall, 10 feet thick at the base, a compacted glacier of their own making. For good measure, I sprayed water across the surface from my garden hose, letting the plunging temperatures seal it with a hard, glassy crust that gleamed under the weak winter sun. I double-checked everything with my handheld GPS unit, the entire structure set inches inside my surveyed line, not one flake encroached on their road, legally untouchable, practically devastating. By dusk, the barricade stood complete, a frozen monument bisecting their escape route. From the road, it looked as though a chunk of Arctic ridge had calved off and planted itself exactly where it would cause maximum inconvenience. I shut down the loader, stepped back, and allowed myself the faintest sense of equilibrium. For the first time in weeks, the weight pressing down on me had shifted. That night, I slept deeply, the kind of rest that comes when action finally aligns with conviction. Morning brought the payoff. It started with distant shouts, muffled through the trees, then escalated into a symphony of slamming doors, spinning tires, and revving engines. By the time I carried my coffee onto the porch, the performance was in full swing. A cluster of residents had gathered at the base of the wall, bundled in expensive parkas and clutching travel mugs, staring up at the icy barrier as though it had materialized from another dimension. A white SUV sporting an HOA decal was already mired in a slush pocket, its tires whining uselessly. At the forefront stood Karen Delaney, her red blazer vivid against the white gloves, arms waving like signal flags. "He's blocked the entire road!" she shrieked, her voice carrying clear across the divide. "This is criminal. We have children trapped in here." A man I vaguely recognized from past zoning hearings shook his head. "It's not on the road, Karen. Look, it stops right at the white line. That's his property." "It's obstructing access," she snapped. Another voice, quieter but sharp enough to cut through, interjected, "Kind of like the way our plows obstructed his shed." The crowd rippled. A few heads turned toward the collapsed structure visible in the distance behind my house. Karen's mouth opened, then closed without a retort. Someone else, a woman cradling a toddler on her hip, murmured, "Is that our snow?" Karen offered no answer. I remained on the porch, silent steam rising from my mug. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I simply observed as confusion and frustration, once aimed solely at me, began to fracture and redirect. The wall held for 3 full days. 3 days of undelivered packages, cancelled appointments, residents forced to park on the main road and trudge hundreds of yards through drifts. 3 days of frantic HOA app threads and whispered complaints. An anonymous neighbor, bless them, forwarded me screenshots of the group chat. Why is there suddenly a giant ice dam at the exit? Did the city authorize this? Can we sue the guy? He's not even in the HOA. I heard the board was dumping on his land first. Someone should just talk to him. He's a vet, right? Talk to me now, after weeks of trespass and threats, after burying my shed and dismissing my warnings. No, they had chosen snow as their weapon. I had merely returned it, re-engineered and repositioned. Each day, I added fresh layers from the remaining drifts on my acreage, packing tighter, sculpting the face until it resembled a deliberate dam. I mounted bright orange safety flags along the crest, purely for visibility, of course. I even laminated a sign and staked it front and center. Private property, do not cross. Structure composed entirely of unauthorized, displaced refuse. Trespassers will be documented and reported. Clear, legal, poetic. On the second afternoon, Cole Mason's black Range Rover lingered at the wall's edge for nearly 15 minutes. He never stepped out, just sat behind tinted glass, clipboard undoubtedly in hand, staring at the frozen testament to his board's miscalculation. On the third morning, the city finally arrived. 2 public works employees in neon vests walked the length of the barricade, snapping photos, consulting tablets. One approached my porch. His name tag read, "Tyson." "Mr. Bishop," I confirmed. He glanced back at the wall, his lips twitching with reluctant admiration. "Gotta say, that's one hell of a snow sculpture." I handed him a prepared folder, survey maps, boundary certification, chronological documentation, video, stills. Every ounce in that wall came from their equipment onto my land first. I simply relocated it. He paged through, his expression shifting from amusement to respect. "We got a complaint about emergency access obstruction." "It's not on their pavement," I said, gesturing. "That shoulder is mine. They still have full lane width." Tyson nodded. "Checks out. We'll note it." As he turned to leave, he paused. "Word of advice? They'll escalate. They always do." I met his eyes. "I'm ready." And they did escalate. That same afternoon, Karen's latest email arrived. The tone shifted from command to thinly veiled pleading. "Mr. Bishop, in the interest of neighborly cooperation, we respectfully request the removal of the current ice structure impeding community access. While past events may have involved misunderstandings, it is vital we move toward amicable resolution. Sterling Pine stands ready to discuss equitable future winter management arrangements. We await your convenience for a meeting. Karen Delaney." Corporation. Now that their residents were inconvenienced, now that control had slipped, suddenly I was a neighbor worthy of dialogue. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked out and reinforced the wall with another dense layer, each bucket a silent reminder. Boundaries are not suggestions. That evening, a small knot of residents gathered again, angered now by curiosity. One man in a knit beanie waved cautiously. "Hey, Mike from Pinon Lane. Look, most of us didn't know about the dumping. That wasn't right." I nodded once. He raised both hands in surrender. Just wanted to say this thing you built is, honestly, kind of legendary. I allowed the corner of my mouth to lift. Thanks. Think it'll melt come spring? Eventually, I said, and I meant it. Let them live with the consequences a while longer. Let them explain to delivery drivers and visiting relatives why their exclusive enclave was sealed by a monument of their own hubris. For the first time since the first illegal load, I wasn't the one buried. I was the one holding the line. The morning light on the fourth day broke sharp and unforgiving, turning the wall into a blinding sheet of crystalline armor. Overnight cold had polished its surface to a mirror finish, throwing back reflections of bare branches and pale sky. It no longer resembled a mere pile of relocated refuse. It stood like a deliberate fortification, a silent sentinel marking the exact edge of what was mine. To them it was sabotage. To me, it was just as frozen, patient, and unyielding. That was the morning Karen finally shattered. I was in the garage, sorting through the splintered remains of the shed, separating salvageable tools from twisted metal, when the shouting erupted. Not the distant grumbling of frustrated residents, but a raw, piercing tirade that cut through the still air like a blade. I stepped outside, rage in hand, and saw her planted at the base of the wall, boots sunk in the shoulder drift, face flushed crimson against the white expanse. "This is illegal!" she screamed, her voice cracking with fury and something closer to desperation. "You can't seal off an entire community. You're deranged." Steam billowed from her mouth in furious clouds. Her signature red blazer looked almost violent against the monochrome landscape, hair escaping its tight bun in wild strands. I stayed on the porch, unmoving. She stalked closer, halting just shy of the boundary, as if an invisible force field held her back. "This is endangerment. What about ambulances? Fire trucks? Lives are at stake here." "Then they'll use the secondary access," I replied, my voice level. "There is no secondary access," she shrieked. "You know that?" I tilted my head slightly. "Design flaw, then. Something the HOA board should have addressed during planning." Her eyes bulged. "You think this is a joke? You're toying with people's safety?" "No," I said. "You started toying with mine the moment you turned my land into your landfill. 30 tons, Karen. 30 tons that crushed my shed. That was accidental runoff. I have video of your contractors crossing my line 6 separate times. Deliberate. Documented." She flung her arms wide, nearly slipping on the ice. "We're suing you. This ends today." "Excellent," I answered. "Discovery will be fascinating. I'll bring the footage, the GPS logs, the collapsed structure photos. You bring whatever you've got." The words landed like a hammer. I watched the realization flicker across her face. Not remorse, but the dawning terror of someone who had finally overplayed a winning hand. She wasn't facing an irritated recluse anymore. She was facing a man with evidence stacked higher than the wall itself. Behind her, residents had begun to gather again, phones subtly raised, pretending to check messages while recording the meltdown. An elderly woman shook her head and walked away, muttering. A younger couple exchanged glances that carried no sympathy for their president. Karen spun, scanning the growing audience, and saw the shift. The room, her carefully curated community, was no longer hers to command. She retreated in stumbling steps, refusing offered arms, storming back toward the clubhouse with her coat flapping like a defeated banner. I remained on the porch long after she vanished, the cold seeping through my jacket, but unable to touch the calm that had settled over me. Not triumph, not yet, just the quiet knowledge that the tide had turned. That afternoon, an unmarked city sedan crunched down the county road and parked near the wall. 2 officials emerged, badges glinting, snowshoes laced tight. The man introduced himself as Marcus Lyons, land use inspector. His assistant Celia carried a tablet and measuring tape. "We've had complaints from Sterling Pines," Marcus said, eyeing the barricade with professional curiosity. "Claims of obstructed critical access and safety hazards." I handed over my ever-ready folder. I expected as much. Full documentation inside, surveys, timelines, video captures. The structure is built exclusively from material illegally displaced onto my property. It occupies only my surveyed shoulder, no encroachment on their pavement. Marcus flipped through the pages, his expression growing more serious with each turn. Celia walked the base, confirming the boundary with her own device. "He's correct," she reported back. "The wall sits entirely on his side." Marcus closed the folder. "We'll need to confer with both parties, but preliminarily, you've stayed within your rights. Impressively so." "I've had time to prepare," I said. He gave a small nod of understanding. "Expect official correspondence soon." They departed without drama, leaving the wall untouched. That night, I stood at its crest with a lantern, surveying the darkened subdivision beyond. Streetlights cast weak pools on stalled vehicles and empty cul-de-sacs. No plows moved. No new heaps appeared on my slope. Silence reigned. Not the fragile hush before another violation, but the heavier quiet that follows a decisive stand. Yet I knew better than to declare victory. People like Karen do not yield gracefully. When pushed into a corner, they tend to react aggressively, employing legal tactics and every resource available to them. As expected, the confrontation arrived 2 days later, just before midday. 3 deliberate knocks echoed on my door, carrying an undeniable sense of authority. Upon opening it, I found Deputy Jenkins once more, accompanied by his junior colleague. They appeared more stern than on our previous encounter, their gazes scanning the wall behind me with heightened scrutiny. "Mr. Bishop," Deputy Jenkins began, his voice measured, "we're responding to a request for a welfare check initiated by the Homeowners Association, coupled with ongoing concerns regarding obstruction of the roadway. Would you mind if we came in for a few questions?" A welfare check. This was Karen's latest stratagem, painting me as erratic, possibly even a threat. If she couldn't prevail with facts, she would resort to instilling fear. I swung the door open wide. "Please come in. Coffee's freshly brewed." Seated at the kitchen table, my comprehensive file already laid out, I calmly presented the entire sequence of events once more, adhering strictly to the chronological order. The deputies meticulously examined the video evidence, studied the maps, and reviewed the relevant ordinances. When Deputy Jenkins spoke again, his tone devoid of any accusation, he remarked, "You've been thorough." "I had to be," I replied. "And the wall's purpose?" "The relocation of unauthorized material back to the property line. Nothing further." The younger deputy stifled a smile. Jenkins shot him a warning glance before closing his notepad. "We'll categorize this as a civil dispute," he stated. "There's no indication of any criminal violation on your part. Your documentation is clear." As they prepared to depart, Jenkins paused. "Off the record," he confided, "I've received more calls from that HOA this winter than I have in the past 5 years combined. This wall is the first solution that actually made sense." A faint smile touched my lips. "Inform Karen I offer snow sculpting services," I suggested. "A veteran's discount." He chuckled as he walked back to their patrol car. Later that day, a single sheet of paper appeared in my mailbox, unfolded, without an envelope. "Mr. Bishop, many of us have only recently grasped the full picture. We mistakenly believed you were simply being uncooperative. We were unaware of the repeated dumping, the shed, none of it. It wasn't fair, and it certainly wasn't right. I apologize." It was from a neighbor, unsigned, but the sentiment felt genuine. I hadn't sought validation or applause, but a fissure was appearing in their united front. By the end of that week, the wall had acquired a certain notoriety. Local social media groups buzzed with shared images. Someone coined it the Great Sterling Pines Ice Barrier and even pinpointed its location on online maps. Teenagers flocked to pose for photographs. One morning, a snow effigy mysteriously materialized, complete with a red scarf, flailing arms, and a miniature clipboard. I left it undisturbed. I proceeded to add another layer of reinforcement, packing it even denser and higher. My motivation was no longer anger, but a steadfast adherence to principle. I had transformed their weapon, their carelessly discarded, contaminated burden, into something impenetrable. Evidence, patience, resolve, and now the law, the community, and even the elements themselves stood in my favor. Karen was running out of options, and my efforts were just beginning. The cracks in Sterling Pines' polished exterior began to spread with the swiftness of melting spring snow. First, an official communique from the city arrived in a crisp envelope bearing the municipal seal. It announced a formal investigation under Code 12145, pertaining to the improper displacement of waste by a private association. The notice cited a preliminary review of submitted evidence and multiple citizen complaints, stating that Rosegate would conduct a comprehensive investigation into the HOA's winter operations. I had not lodged a public complaint myself, but I had discreetly forwarded copies of my meticulously compiled dossier, including time-stamped videos, GPS overlays, and documented ordinance violations, through the channels Dana had recommended. There was no fanfare, only a steady, methodical dissemination of truth, delivered piece by irrefutable piece. Karen had clearly not anticipated such public scrutiny. The next sign of discord came not from her, but via email from her legal representative. "Mr. Bishop," the message began, "I have been retained by the Sterling Pines Homeowners Association. My client acknowledges your allegations and the pending municipal review. In the interest of de-escalation and fostering community harmony, we propose a confidential meeting to explore mutually acceptable resolution options. Kindly advise of your availability. Angela Bryan, Esquire." There was no denial and no further threats, only the courteous language of someone whose foundation was beginning to crumble. I chose not to respond. Private arrangements and clandestine agreements were never the objective. This was about public, documented, and lasting accountability. 2 days later, public works crews arrived, equipped with laser scanners, soil probes, and clipboards. They bypassed my property entirely, focusing their attention on the subdivision's internal areas, the community green space, the retention basin bone, dry and snow-free, and the embankment behind the clubhouse, along with the narrow green strips never intended for substantial storage. Within hours, violations accumulated like fresh snowdrifts. Failure to designate appropriate disposal sites, proximity of contaminated refuse to protected watershed areas, absence of a filed annual winter management plan, and documented trespass onto adjacent private property. The city imposed a preliminary fine of $12,000 on the HOA. Modest by their standards, perhaps, but the symbolic impact was devastating. For the first time in their meticulously curated history, Sterling Pines was officially cited, recorded, and exposed. That Friday evening, Karen convened an emergency membership meeting at the clubhouse. Typically, these gatherings were understated affairs, characterized by scented candles, neatly arranged seating, and a politely bubbling coffee urn. This time, the parking lot was overflowing, with cars lining the streets. Residents queued out the door, bundled against the cold, their faces etched with concern and a multitude of questions. I remained at home, but my friend Ben Holtz, a snowplow contractor, provided real-time updates. His cousin was present at the meeting. "Karen's up there trying to spin it as an unfortunate oversight due to extreme weather," Ben texted. "The crowd isn't buying it. Someone just questioned why the retention basin is empty while his shed got crushed." She reportedly turned pale. Then another resident demanded to see the dumping contracts, which she could not produce. "It's getting ugly, man," Ben reported. His final message arrived after midnight. "They just took a vote, suspended her as president pending a full review. An interim board will take over next week." I set my phone down and stepped out onto the porch. The wall still stood, gleaming under the moonlight, its edges slightly softened by the daytime thaw, but its core remained as solid as ever, a testament not only to their refuse, but to their unraveling. The following afternoon, Cole Mason appeared at my property line for the first time since the turmoil began. He stood just on their side, hat in hand, patiently waiting until I emerged. "Afternoon, Bishop Cole," he began, clearing his throat and glancing toward the barricade. "The board, what's left of it, sent me. Nobody anticipated this escalating the way it did." I waited. "We weren't aware of the full extent," he continued. "The shed collapsing, the volume. We were following Karen's lead, assuming it was just minor overflow. You didn't want to know, I stated quietly. He flinched but offered no denial. Point taken. Silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the distant sigh of wind through the pines. We're drafting new policies, he announced. City-approved sites only, full contractor vetting, no more off-site disposal of any kind. We're also auditing every contract she signed. It turns out a lot of it wasn't properly documented. Sounds like a start, I conceded. He glanced up, meeting my gaze for the first time. You built that wall to send a message. Message received. Loud and clear. Any chance we can help dismantle it? Get things back to normal? I considered his question. The man. The moment. Then I shook my head. No, I said. I'll let nature take its course. A visible wave of relief washed over his face. Fair enough. He turned to leave, then paused. Are you attending the spring cookout the new board is hosting? Trying to reset? I actually laughed. A short, genuine sound that surprised both of us. I'll bring the snow cones. He grinned, despite himself. See you around, Bishop. And he walked away. By late March, the thaw began in earnest. Each sunrise chipped away at the edges. Rivulets carved channels down the face, exposing layers of grit and salt like geological strata of poor decisions. The wall shrank day by day, 7 feet to 5, then 3, until only a slushy ridge remained, studded with my orange flags like forgotten grave markers. But its legacy outlasted the ice. A new sign appeared at the subdivision entrance. Sterling Pines, HOA undergoing structural reform in partnership with the City of Rosegate Planning. New winter protocols enforced. No off-site displacement permitted. Not an apology, but accountability in black and white. The city closed its investigation with a final letter. HOA found at fault. Mandatory policy overhaul. Boundary respect training for all contractors. I framed it and hung it inside the half-rebuilt shed. Karen vanished from sight. Rumors placed her in Sarasota, staying with family. Some suggested an indefinite leave. Others whispered of lawsuits that never materialized. It didn't matter. Her authority had melted faster than the wall. One gray April morning, a familiar car eased into my driveway. Not an HOA vehicle. Her husband. He climbed out in civilian clothes jeans, a sweater, no clipboard, no blazer in sight. He looked older than I remembered, carrying a small paper bag. Won't keep you long, he said. Karen's gone. Moved down to Florida last week. Permanent, far as I know. I nodded. He held out the bag. Inside was a single sheet of heavy linen paper, her handwriting unmistakable. I was wrong. I didn't listen. I believe my position allowed me to redraw lines that weren't mine to move. You showed me what a real boundary looks like. I'm sorry, Karen. I read it twice. The words were spare, almost fragile. She wanted you to have that, he said. And this? He produced an envelope. Cash for shed repairs. I didn't take it. I'll rebuild it myself. He understood. Thought you might say that. He left as quietly as he'd come. That apology, hollow or heartfelt, didn't change what had happened, but it confirmed what I already knew. The wall had done its work, not just in ice and salt, but in consequence, in reminder, in the simple, unshakable truth that one person armed with patience and proof could force an entire system to confront itself and win. Spring arrived not with a roar, but with a steady drip, relentless, patient, inevitable. By mid-April, the once imposing wall had dwindled to a low, tired ridge of gray slush, pocked with embedded gravel and the faded remnants of my orange flags. Patches of stubborn grass emerged beneath it, bent and yellowed, but unbroken, pushing toward the strengthening sun. I never laid a hand on it to hasten the end. I let the seasons do their work, the same way evidence and consequence had done theirs. The earth, it turns out, is remarkably resilient when finally relieved of someone else's burden. The subdivision changed, too. People pass my driveway more slowly now. Windows rolled down on warm days. Hands lifted in cautious waves. Some stopped altogether mail carriers with a quick nod. Dog walkers offering small talk about the weather. I received a tin of homemade muffins from the woman on Alder Lane, a six-pack, and charcoal from Mike on Pinon Lane. A hand-drawn card from a kid named Spencer slid under my door one afternoon, a crayon rendering of the wall with a stick figure me standing triumphant beside a tiny loader scrawled beneath, "Coolest thing ever." I kept the card on my fridge. The new HOA board wasted no time signaling reform. Laura Wilkins, quiet, competent, with a background in real estate, took the interim presidency and made it permanent. One of her first acts was a community-wide email outlining the revised winter protocols. City-vetted disposal only, full transparency on contracts, mandatory boundary training for every contractor, no exceptions. A week later, a discreet plaque appeared near the clubhouse entrance alongside the reform sign. In recognition of community feedback and municipal guidance, Sterling Pines commits to responsible, neighborly, inclusive operations. Still no direct apology to me, but the subtext was unmistakable. I began rebuilding the shed in earnest, not in haste, not with prefab shortcuts. I worked weekends and evenings, cutting each beam by hand, pouring deeper concrete footings, framing a steeper roof with reinforced trusses. I used pressure-treated lumber throughout, galvanized hardware that wouldn't rust, metal roofing in a dark green that blended with the pines. It rose stronger than before, taller doors, better ventilation, a small overhang porch where I could sit out of the rain. One Saturday, an older gentleman I'd never met shuffled up the driveway with a thermos and offered to hold boards while I drilled. We didn't talk much, just measurements and the occasional grunt, but the help was welcome. By early May, the structure stood complete, solid, and square against the skyline. On the inside wall near the new workbench, I mounted a small bronze plaque I'd had engraved downtown. Private land, respected boundaries, winter 2025. It caught the light whenever I opened the door. Mike dropped by one sunny afternoon with that six-pack and a grin. "Whole vibe's different now," he said, cracking open a beer on my new porch step. "Board meetings are actually boring again. Laura runs them like a business, not a dictatorship." I took the offered bottle. "Good. You should come to the cookout next month. They're inviting everyone, inside the gates or not, trying to rebuild trust." I considered it, watching dragonflies skim over the recovering grass where tons of refuse had once sat. "I'll think about it." He laughed. Fair enough. A few weeks later, the formal invitation arrived. Thick cardstock, tasteful font. Laura's handwritten note on the back. "Mr. Bishop, we know you're not a member of the HOA and you never will be, but you're part of this broader neighborhood and we'd be honored if you joined us for the spring gathering. No agendas, just food, music, and a fresh start. Hope to see you there. Laura Wilkins, President, Sterling Pines' HOA." I went, not for forgiveness. I hadn't offered it, and they hadn't asked. I went to see the change with my own eyes. The cookout sprawled across the clubhouse lawn, picnic tables under string lights, smoke curling from grills, kids chasing fireflies. As dusk settled, burgers sizzled. Someone had set up cornhole boards and a playlist of classic rock. Residents mingled in small clusters, laughter carrying on the warm air. No one mentioned the wall directly, but it hovered in every glance. My way, respectful nods, quick smiles, the occasional "glad you could make it." Plates were pressed into my hands, unasked. A cold drink appeared, whenever mine ran low. Laura found me near the dessert table. "I read every page you submitted to the city," she said quietly. "The detail, it was extraordinary." "Had to be," I replied. She nodded. "If we ever forget again, I hope someone holds us accountable the same way." Let's hope it doesn't come to that. We left it there. As night deepened, I slipped away early, walking the gravel road back to my land under a sky thick with stars. The subdivision lights glowed softly behind me, contained, no longer spilling over boundaries drawn long ago. My property felt different too, not because the grass had greened or the shed stood taller, but because the invisible line around it, once ignored, then contested, now acknowledged, had become something tangible, a psychological border, a social one. They no longer tested it. They no longer assumed. And if anyone ever tried again, I glanced toward the shed, where my loader waited under its new roof, and allowed myself a small, private smile. I was ready. Summer settled in fully by June, the kind of warm, languid days that made the winter feel like a distant nightmare. The air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and pine resin instead of diesel and dicer. My 2 acres had recovered remarkably. The slope, where tons of contaminated ice had once dominated, now bloomed with wildflowers and resilient patches of green. The earth, given space to breathe, had reclaimed itself. So had I. The shed stood as my quiet testament, sturdy, purposeful, built to last through whatever came next. I spent evenings there organizing tools on pegboards, wiping down the workbench, occasionally pausing to read the bronze plaque by lantern light. It wasn't vanity, it was a reminder. The neighborhood, too, had found a new equilibrium. Residents no longer averted their eyes when passing. Conversations at the mailbox lingered, longer talk of gardening tips, fishing spots, the upcoming county fair. Mike from Pinion Lane became a semi-regular visitor, showing up with cold drinks and stories from the reformed board meetings. "Is like night and day," he'd say. "No more secret votes or surprise assessments. Laura runs transparent budgets, posted online, minutes emailed, same night." I listened more than I spoke, but the ease of it felt earned. One humid afternoon in July, a sleek black sedan eased into my driveway, out-of-state plates, rental, clean. A woman stepped out, mid-40s, professional blouse and slacks, sunglasses perched in her hair. She looked familiar, but it took a moment to place her. "Dana," I said, wiping sawdust from my hands as I emerged from the shed. She smiled, extending a hand. "Thought I'd drop by since I was in the area for a city consulting gig." We settled on the porch with iced tea. She glanced around the rebuilt shed, the thriving land, the faint scar where the wall had melted. "You did it," she said simply. "The whole inquiry stemmed from your submissions. They're using your documentation as a training case now, how not to manage winter operations." I shrugged. "Just wanted my property back." "More than that," she countered. "You exposed a pattern. Other subdivisions are auditing their boards because of this quiet ripple effect." We talked shop for a while, code updates, enforcement trends, before she stood to leave. "If you ever want to consult again," she said, "doors are open. I'll stick to woodworking." She laughed and drove off, leaving dust settling in the sunlight. The biggest shift came in August, on a day when thunderstorms threatened but never quite arrived. Laura Wilkins appeared at my door unannounced, holding a folder and looking slightly nervous. "Hope I'm not intruding," she began. "I wanted to deliver this personally." Inside the folder, the final city report, stamped closed, full exoneration on my actions, permanent injunction against any future off-site displacement by Sterling Pines, and a mandated annual boundary survey at HOA expense. "There's something else," she added, pulling out a second sheet. "The board voted unanimously to name a small community fund after the lessons from this winter. It's for property improvement grants, open to all neighbors, inside or outside the gates. We'd like to call it the Bishop Boundary Respect Initiative." I raised an eyebrow. She hurried on. "It's not charity, it's acknowledgement. And the first grant check is made out to you for any lingering repairs or upgrades." The amount covered far more than the shed. I didn't tear it up. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. "I'll think on it," I said. She nodded, understanding. "Take your time." As fall hinted at the horizon, leaves tinging gold, air sharpening at night, I found myself reflecting more than planning revenge. The war was over, not because they'd surrendered outright, but because the battlefield had changed. Respect wasn't demanded anymore. It was given freely, earned through the long, cold months of standing firm. One crisp September evening, I walked the old boundary line at dusk. The red stakes had long since been removed. The yellow tape faded into memory, but the line remained clearer than ever in the minds of those across the road. I paused, where the wall had stood tallest, now just smooth grass underfoot. No monument needed marking the spot. The story itself had become the marker, and as the first stars appeared overhead, I turned back toward the glow of my porch light. The land was quiet, the boundaries secure. For the first time in many years, a profound sense of peace settled within me, beyond mere possession of my land. Though winter's return was inevitable, this time I stood on firm ground, a certainty shared by all. Now, in the serene heart of early summer, with the sun painting long golden strokes across the pines, my property feels intrinsically mine once more. This feeling transcends legal documentation, resonating deep within my very being. The harsh remnants of that severe winter have long since vanished. The incline that once bore the imposing weight of glacial debris now flourishes as a vibrant green expanse, adorned with the cheerful dance of black-eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace, gently swaying in the breeze. The familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots on the driveway echoes as always, yet it carries no trace of past anxieties. The small utility building stands resolute, its renewed roof gleaming like a fulfilled promise, exuding strength and uprightness. I find solace in the evenings on its modest porch, a cooling cup of coffee by my side, observing the flickering dance of fireflies illuminating the field. The polished bronze plaque gleams each time the door opens. Private land, respected boundaries. Winter 2025. It's not merely for adornment, but a testament to enduring memory. It recalls those nights spent indoors, diligently gathering proof while the tempest raged. It remembers the morning I surveyed the utter devastation and resolved that enough was definitively enough. Across the way, Sterling Pines now resonates with a palpably different aura. Vehicles gracefully decelerate as they approach my mailbox. Windows are lowered and friendly waves are exchanged without reservation. Conversations easily spring forth, discussing the prime fishing spots in the nearby creek or the abundant growth of wild raspberries this season. Without conscious effort, I have seamlessly reintegrated into the community's rhythm. Not within their enclosed domain, never there, but I am recognized, I am seen. Mike continues to make his customary visits, bringing refreshing beverages and keeping me informed of local happenings. Laura's newly appointed board of directors operates with flawless efficiency. Financial records are transparent, decisions are made through open voting, and contractors adhere to stringent, unyielding guidelines. Karen's name is no longer uttered. She remains a distant specter in Florida, her ostentatious red blazer and forceful directives dissolving as completely as the very barrier that once defined their property. The initial cookout invitation evolved into a series of unpretentious, recurring get-togethers where, for a few hours, the dividing line between our properties effectively disappears. I attend when I feel inclined and depart at my leisure. There are no pressures, no expectations placed upon me. One warm August evening, following a convivial barbecue that filled the darkness with joyous sounds, Laura accompanied me to the fringe of the clubhouse lawn. "We still discuss it, you know," she said softly. "Not the wall itself, but the lessons it imparted, that regulations are only effective when universally observed and respected." I gave a subtle nod. Boundaries must possess genuine substance to hold meaning. A gentle smile touched her lips. "You helped us reaffirm the substance of ours." We parted with a simple, understanding handshake, devoid of grand pronouncements or elaborate gestures. Nowadays, when storms gather, with thunder echoing across the mountain ridges and rain lashing against the panes, I no longer feel that familiar tightening of anxiety. I don't scan the tree line for approaching headlights or listen for the ominous rumble of heavy machinery. The surveillance cameras, though still discreetly positioned amongst the branches, now gather dust on their memory cards. Winter will undoubtedly return, as it always does. The initial snowflakes will descend, the snowplows will begin their noisy work, and the roads will require clearing. However, I now possess a profound certainty, a conviction that runs deeper than any property marker. They will remain within their designated confines. They will manage their challenges within the perimeter of their own grounds, having learned a harsh, chilling lesson about the consequences of failing to do so. And I, too, have gained invaluable insight. True ownership transcends a mere document stored away. It is not defined by physical barriers, symbolic flags, or even a formidable 7-foot wall constructed from their own frozen resolve. It is the quiet, unwavering assurance that you will stand firm, that you will meticulously document, that you will patiently endure, and that when pushed to your limits, a single individual armed with patience, irrefutable evidence, and an unyielding spirit can fundamentally reshape the landscape for everyone. My land is tranquil now. My boundaries are universally respected, and should anyone ever forget this truth again, I still possess the heavy machinery. I still have the recorded evidence. The plaque still gleams under the lamplight, and I retain the resolute determination to remind them, though I suspect it will not be necessary. The message was delivered through the icy grip of consequence, documented proof, and ultimately it will endure far longer than any passing storm.